Hello, everyone. Welcome to Writers Drinking Coffee. This is a podcast based on writers sitting around drinking and talking about writing, publishing, and the whole creative process. We do not censor ourselves, so consider us PG-13. Today's hosting committee is Chaz and Karen Brenchley and me, Jeannie Warner. This is episode 60, Weird Wars with Sean Patrick Hazlett. Welcome, Sean.
Hey, thank you very much for introducing me to the podcast.
Yeah, now is it Sean or Sean Patrick? You seem to use both of it in some of your work there.
Yeah, so Sean Patrick Hazlett is generally the name that you can find me in writing by, but for the purposes of this conversation, Sean is perfectly fine, and it's shorter.
I like to check, but we have Mary Robinette, and by goodness it's Mary Robinette, and I will never offend her by leaving it off. So you have written, as I go out and looked you up on Wikipedia, you have written a lot of horror and sci-fi and fantasy, and I really enjoyed a couple of the stories that I found out there. How did you get started writing stories? Where did it all come from?
Oh, geez. So it started a long time ago when I was in fifth grade. I wrote a ton of stories that year. And then, after that, I kind of went along with the rest of my life. And starting, I would say, around 2000, when I was in the military, I started, trying to write a novel and, created a whole world around it and, had written a lot, but never quite finished. And it wasn't until 2011 that I really started, getting much more serious about, submitting writing to professional publications. And the reason I started with short stories is it allowed me with an opportunity to fail faster because I didn't know if I was any good. And, I needed to, it is very easy to get very fast feedback for anybody who's submitted a short story. It's sometimes, and I would say instantaneous, but sometimes within a day. So that's when I got at least, began that journey.
Okay, but looking at your bibliography, you seem not to have moved on from short stories and novellas. I mean, there isn't a novel yet, is there?
No, there's not a novel that I've published yet. I've written one.
Is that deliberate?
What's that?
Is that deliberate? Or is it just that you've written a lot of novels that you weren't good enough?
So I wrote one novel that I would put in the not good enough category. And so my view on that was I needed more work or more recognition on the short story side.
Right.
To just kind of get better at writing and build up.
Yeah.
I've written a second novel that I haven't shopped around yet because it's a first draft, and I'd say it's not good enough yet.
Okay.
So yeah, and it takes a long time. The tough part about novels is you spend a year, go close to a year on something, and you refine it, and then you kind of just send it out into the world. And it's a really hard process. And I think there are other.
So you don't have any kind of writers group or any kind of people that you bounce things off on as you go along?
I do, but it's infrequent. So my family. So my wife Claire reads everything that I've written. I probably drive her crazy with that. I sometimes share with other writers, but it's infrequent because my concern is that it just takes a lot of time for other writers to read your work, and it takes a lot of time for you to read their unpolished work. So what I typically do is I do anything that I send out into the world has at least 7 revisions, and that's not by design. It's just I keep going over it until it feels just right.
Right. That's more or less what I do. I mean, my wife sees everything because she's sort of, here, and I'm obliged to keep her happy. But other than that, pretty much nobody sees anything until it goes to my agent or my publisher. It's the way I grew up, and it's the way I'm comfortable with.
Yeah, and to your point, one thing that I found difficult about doing more writer, kind of a writers group scenario is I would find out spending more time kind of helping, working on reading other people's work and not really writing enough on my own. And for me, it just...
Sorry.
Go ahead.
And then there's that other thing where you take a piece of work to a writers group and you get 6 different opinions on it. And that's not useful.
Yeah.
Because they're all conflicting, they're all sort of in opposition to each other. And I don't see how that is a path to a single better fiction.
I agree with that. And another thing too,
go ahead.
Sometimes you get very positive feedback. And I'll take a story, in past groups, I've taken a story that's been rejected 40 times. And somebody will say, oh, that'll sell to analog in a heartbeat. And you're like, it's been rejected by analog.
No.
So like that's the other piece too. People are not, I'm very critical and very self-critical. And in writers groups, I can also come across as a little bit more, I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear. I'm going to tell you what I think is going to improve your work. And I could be wrong.
Sure.
No, I think it's important, but I just want to argue the other point of view. Sometimes you may think you have a full idea out there on the paper, but your brain is filling things in. And having 5 people, if 3 of them say, oh, your theme is clearly, snowflakes are awesome, and the other 2 are like, no, the theme is the oil strikes, and you're sitting there thinking to yourself, my theme wasn't any of these things. I need to go back and look at it again. It's useful to know people that are you getting your main ideas out, and are they all down there? I mean, even if all of them are wrong.
Yeah, it's useful to know that you can be misread, but I take that as a given.
Well, there's also the point of who's in your writing group, okay?
Yes.
Because if the other people in your writing group have all written novels, sold massive trilogies, won awards and so on, kind of like my writers group, where I'm like one of the, one who hasn't finished a novel, that is a different kind of writing group than your buddies that, from the science fiction club.
Yes, if I were in a writing group with Stephen King, I would absolutely make use of that writing group.
Oh yeah.
So as a question then, what is your first novel here a genre that you're working on, or is it horror? What's been your process about it?
So generally and this is also kind of a business perspective, or I look at it I take a business approach. What I do is I find if I have a short story that, I sold or did well or got really good reviews, I use that as, an opportunity to seed the market with an idea. And if there's an audience for that idea, that's usually where the germ of a novel begins. And both novels that I have are, came from the germs of short stories. So at least that's my approach. I don't know if it's going to work, but time will tell once I finish.
But that approach, coupled with your observable long published history in short fiction, suggests that short fiction is the focus of your creativity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's definitely the focus of my creativity, and it's born of 2 things, right? I mentioned it. The first thing at the very beginning was the fail faster methodology. So I still haven't appeared in like the top 3 fiction markets. So, fantasy and science fiction, analog and Asimov's.
Yep.
I've gotten good, thoughtful rejections from C.C. Finley in particular. I've gotten 1 or 2.
Wonderful.
Yeah. He's absolutely amazing. I mean, he's definitely, if you're in the short story game, like you really have to be comfortable with rejection. You really have to love what you do, because you're going to get I've literally had thousands. I mean, not thousands. I would say over 2,000 rejections, but I've sold, maybe between 60 and 70% of what I've written. Nice. It's just not at the highest rate all the time, right? Sure. I just, you sell to the top markets, and then you just slowly work your way down. So, but I'm not, I haven't gotten there. And I've sold to like a, publication like Terraform, which pays great rates. But to your point, I'm trying to circle back to what you're talking about. You do also develop, what I think is a good story is not necessarily what the market thinks is a good story. And it's still hard for me to calibrate what will sell and what won't. So the thing that I sold to Terraform, which also ended up in a best of military science fiction anthology from Bain, was not I didn't really think very much of the story. I just kind of leveraged my military background, wrote a story that was, a near future scenario that I could see happening with the current trends in technology. And I originally wrote it for, a company called Sci Futures for one of their clients, which I think was NATO at the time. So I just wrote this thing and got paid for that. They released the rights back to me, and I just sent it out to, a bunch of publications, and it sold at Terraform, and I was kind of surprised. So what I do notice is that there's a trend of what I sell and what I don't. And the trend right now is the stories that I write that have the highest probability of selling tend to either be very technical military science fiction, near future speculative stories, or horror stories. Anything else, still, I will sell, but I don't sell at the highest rates.
Right.
Well, the thing is, you have that background. Okay. I mean, there are some writers, I'm sure, who would just love to have a background that's got such a ready market, like, as you were saying, your military background and so on. If you don't mind me asking, what did you do in the military? If you mind asking, just tell me, I don't care. But I would think that using that background, leveraging a background like that, I'm a software engineer. Whoopee, I'm a dime a dozen.
Well, I would say a dime a dozen. I mean, software engineers, it's hard to learn how to program.
I'm in marketing, and I wince every time you both use the word leveraging as a noun. So,
Darling,
it does sound very businesslike.
No, but did you do, I mean, you were in an armored cavalry. So were you tank or APC?
Tank. So I'll just go through, but my military background is actually very relevant to the weird World War III anthology, and I'll explain why. So, after college, I went into the U.S. Army as an officer.
Had you intended that through college?
What's that?
Had you intended to do that all the way through college? Was that the goal?
Yes. So when I was when I was applying to college, I was seriously considering going to one of the 3 U.S. military academies. And I had to make a decision at the age of 18 because I had appointments at West Point, Annapolis, and the Air Force Academy. Incidentally, I mean, this is just random trivia. I was, because I'm from Delaware, state of Delaware, I was then Senator Biden's primary nominee at the Air Force Academy. I turned him down because at the age of 18, I had to make a decision about whether or not I wanted to make it a career or if I wanted to try it out for 4 years and then go and do something in the civilian world. So I wasn't quite sure. If you're 100% sure and you want to be a careerist, the military academies are probably your best option.
Sure.
But I also got into this school called Stanford that was on the West Coast. I had never been to California. My dad was freaking out because of the cost. And I said, Dad, I have an ROTC scholarship. I got 80% of the tuition.
Oh, nice.
And then I had a few other scholarships that would literally cost them cost us $200 a year. And then if you fit room and board, I'd be good to go. Cause my mother and father were both teachers.
Okay.
And, even back then you can't afford a Stanford education with, that kind of a salary. So I kind of solved my own problem. So anyway, that's why I chose ROTC over West Point. And then from there, I definitely wanted to serve. I just wasn't sure for how long.
What did you do at Stanford? What did you study? So
I did 2 degrees. So I did a Bachelor's of Science degree in electrical engineering, and then I did a Bachelor of Arts degree in history. One, because again, I wanted to be practical and I wanted to have a good return on investment on that degree. So that is the engineering. And then I've always loved history. I loved learning about the past. I love writing. And the 2, were about as far apart as you could get. But I felt I would have a well-rounded education in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do these in parallel?
Yeah.
In the UK, we'd call it double honours.
Yeah. So it was, I wouldn't say honors, but it was I got 2 separate degrees. So it wasn't a double major. It was just 2 independent degrees in 4 years. Now, I had taken a lot of, in the U.S., they have advanced placement classes in high school where you can take, a test to prove that you've passed out of, subjects like calculus and AP biology and stuff like that. So when I got to Stanford, I was the equivalent of a sophomore. So I was able to take the, extra classes to fill up that fourth year, because the military or ROTC required me to do 4 years, even though I could have completed my degree in 3.
Look, I'm sorry to keep on about this, because we should be talking about books and writing and stuff, but I'm fascinated.
But we should take the interview where it takes, because I want to make sure that the audience is, that we talk about interesting things. And if this is where you think the audience wants to go,
this is where I want to go. How much time in these 4 years, how much time do you actually have to give to the military that they take away from your studying?
So there would be about 3 days a week where I would have to go to Santa Clara University, because ROTC wasn't on campus at the time at Stanford.
Okay.
And then we'd take 2 classes that were, in classroom, and then there would be drill, and then you'd have to go away for, a weekend or 2 a quarter to, for field training. And then in your junior year, I went to Fort Lewis, Washington, where we, it's not basic training, but it was cadet training, where you're in a barracks and you go to the field and you conduct exercises for about 6 weeks or so.
So
if I can,
writer,
hold on a second, Karen. I was going to say, there's a piece of that because you came from tanks. David Drake also is a tank guy, and there is nobody happier to geek out about tanks and hover tanks in a bar than David Drake. So there's a piece of that enthusiasm for military and the actual technical bits of it and the sound of what happens in one order that I think, honestly, the experience that you have there adds to the writing because of that.
Well, funny thing about David Drake. So he, as you know, he's in Weird World War III anthology. He served in the same armored unit that I did, only he did it in Vietnam. Yeah. So we both served in the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. Cool. So, that's the other kind of interesting piece about him. And he probably was there when they were using the old Sheridan tanks. Incidentally, at the National Training Center, when I was there, we were kind of the last in the Army to use Sheridan tanks because, they're cheaper to use than the M1 and, and they look different. So you don't give the U.S. Army a negative training, have a negative training effect where you condition them to shoot at their own tanks, right? They shoot at something that looks different.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
This is pro tip.
Have you actually gotten in touch with Bain, or do you sell to Bain a lot, or in those kinds of things? Have you taken David Drake out for drinks? Have you done any networking that way?
There's many of the authors that are in the anthology that I know from either Writers of the Future or other events. So Mike Resnick, who sadly passed away earlier this year, and there's actually at the beginning of my forward, I dedicate the book to him, and also a friend of mine who was also in the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment who was killed in Iraq. But he is, and as I'm sure you're all very aware, was a tremendous human being who dedicated his life and all the experience he had to giving back and mentoring new authors and new editors. And it was on his advice when I asked him to be part of an earlier anthology that I pitched to Bain that they didn't accept. His advice was, have another anthology ready, have another pitch immediately ready that you can send if it gets rejected. So that idea got rejected because it wasn't really, it was something that was a little bit off-brand for Bain, and frankly might not have had the commercial appeal.
We're dying to know what was it.
Did, but this was the second one I sent.
Yeah.
What was it? Your first idea.
So it was called The Future of Capitalism. And what I did is I had, if you've ever seen that political compass, right, where you have kind of authoritarian, economic liberalism. I can't remember what both coordinates are, but I had authors that fit in each of those areas. So, Eric Flint and Nick Mamatas were, interested in the kind of the left. I had Brad Torgerson, on the right, and a few others. and they had all agreed to be part of the anthology. But it's really not. If you look at what Bain publishes, it's not really an on-brand thing for Bain. I still think it would have been.
Bain is all about its brand. They're very focused.
Yeah, and it's a successful strategy, right? So the second thing I submitted was this weird World War III idea,
right?
And that was based on my military experience. So when I was at the National Training Center in the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, I was stationed at the National Training Center. Now the National Training Center has been around, since World War II, and it was originally a training center where Patton trained there, his forces there, things like that. And the reason it's there is because it's in the middle of the desert, right? There's lots of space, and you can train and make loud noises, and you don't really disturb very much. Yeah. So, and I say this because when I was leaving the military, my last job was as a public affairs officer, and it was right before right when we were about to invade Iraq, and every reporter that I talked to wanted me to work into the story how this place was founded to train and for desert combat, and that's not true. Right, in the 80s they used it again because it was cheap, lots of space, but they used it to train forces to fight across the plains of Central Europe.
Sure.
Right, when you had your peer competitor that was the Russians. But regardless, what we did there, during my time, and it was kind of the end of that, it faded into a new era. But in the kind of the 80s and 90s, the primary job that my unit had was as the opposing forces. So, and we would fight. We're called the Op 4, right? That's again short for opposing forces, and we would fight Blue 4, right, which was Blue Force. And what they would do is they would rotate a brigade or a regiment to fight us in an area that is 1,000 square miles. It was roughly the size of the state of Rhode Island. And my unit would fight 10 of these rotations a year. So by the time I got done, I probably fought 30 rotations, maybe close to 100 battles. So you get so good. And I also learned how to use Russian doctrine and tactics, or Soviet doctrine and tactics. And that's what we fought. Another aside, I'm kind of.
I was going to say that reminded me so much of the line from Patton, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard! I read your book."
Yeah, that's what we did. So we fought like the Russians, and we became very good at what we did. I knew every nook and cranny of that area. Like I could, if we're driving along and you asked me for an 8-digit grid coordinate, I could get within, within one click by just looking around and saying we're probably around 30, whatever the grid was at the time.
Okay,
we became very proficient, and we became very proficient for a reason. Our goal was to expose the weaknesses of U.S. forces, and we generally won every battle. I can only remember one battle where we were beaten pretty badly, but that's one out of maybe 100.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
So I want to go on talking about this forever because this is fascinating to me. But tell us about your anthology.
Well, I was going to say when you finish that up, can I focus that question even more? How did you suddenly decide you can pitch an anthology to a publisher? Can anybody do that?
So this is a dangerous answer because I could get in trouble. But I mean, the short answer is yes, of course. But when you do it, you need to do your research. You need to talk to editors who have successfully published with particular publishers. You also, should understand, what their process is, and you have to be business minded. You have to pitch it in a way that make that idea. Why is that idea relevant? Why now? How does it fit with the brand of the publisher that you're working with? So if you look at Weird World War III, it's pretty obvious how it fits Bain's brand. But there's also there are also some authors in it that are a little bit off-brand, but I can kind of carry them in. So when you say Weird World War III, you're going to have some stories that are, if you step back and think of the overall anthology, think Tom Clancy meets Stephen King or H.P. Lovecraft, right? So you can go if you're a purist in the weird genre, there are going to be some stories you can find in there that will satisfy you. But if you're also like a fan of David Drake, right, with really realistic, rigorous military, in this case, military fantasy is what he wrote, then you'll also be able to find that there. So on the weird side, I have a story from an author that is not traditionally a Baen author. So you've probably all heard of John Langan.
Sure.
And he writes an absolutely brilliant story about cosmonauts facing off against astronauts on the surface of the moon in the wake of a limited nuclear exchange on Earth. And he describes the Earth, kind of the swirling blackness. And then he has a Lovecraftian beastie that you'll immediately recognize when you start reading the story, that it kind of comes in between. And it's just a magnificent story. And I was on pins and needles because I was just hoping that he would turn in the story on time, and he did, and it just knocked my socks off. I'm so excited about it. And there's also and then you also have traditionalists like David Drake, who again, he's got a story about Cambodia and with a supernatural twist that is as brilliant and wonderful as you would expect a David Drake story to be. And then there's newcomers like Brian Trent, who essentially create an entirely new unit of special forces that focus on fighting in interdimensional warfare. And then he ties it brilliantly at the end with his ending, connects it all back to kind of give it a Lovecraftian feel at the end. So there's a lot of stories in there that are just absolutely fascinating. And there's also stories there that take kernels from real life and then build upon them. So Sarah Hoyt has a story that talks about, that riffs off of the Project Stargate and takes it, in a different direction. But Project Stargate was a real program that the DoD had, and they had several precursor programs that are just crazy. If you look at, and you just go to the CIA website, you can find it. Like it's all there.
Stargate was the Psi Powers project.
Yes.
Wasn't it?
So more specifically, it was remote viewing, right? Which is a way of a method of reconnaissance that they would use, and it wasn't always always effective. At least if the documents that the CIA posted on its site are real documents and not an attempt at misinformation. So you always have to talk about that. But there were actually several precursor programs too. The first of which that I'm aware of was Project Gondola Wish, which was a comprehensive study of all the things the Soviets had been doing since the 1920s. And it had, I think that project happened in the 1970s, and the U.S. government, freaked out. And it's like, maybe we should be looking at some of this stuff. Mm-hmm. And there were several successes and also several notable failures. So there was one of the successes, I think, were at locating the hostages during the when Hezbollah took them in Beirut. And a failure, I think, was when they were trying to find a brigadier general that was kidnapped by a terrorist group in Italy. I want to say it was I don't know if it was the Baader Meinhof gang but it was something similar to that.
Sure. So this anthology, was it invitation only? Was it open submission? Was it a mix of both?
So the first one was invitation only. And the reason was this is my first attempt as an editor.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get it right the first time I put it out off the bat.
Sure.
And I didn't want to introduce the complexity, and not even the complexity, but the additional workload of having a massive slush thing to read through. But I am cognizant that in the future that's something I need to revisit, because I think I was able to successfully pull this off. And the other thing too, you have to keep in mind that this is not my full-time job. My full-time job is managing a multi-billion-dollar budget for hyper-growth company in Silicon Valley.
Okay.
Are you hiring?
Yeah, you can see it on LinkedIn. It's
Yep.
So when you say you've got these people and it was and you chose them, as it were, did you did you go ask these people, will you be in an anthology, and then pitch the anthology with all of their names attached? Or did you pitch the anthology and then come to them and say, I've got, a deal for this anthology, will you be in it?
So I definitely asked them first, because that's part of the sales process.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're approaching a publisher and some guy that you don't really know too well, you may have heard his name once or twice. He may have published a few stories, but he's never been an editor, and he's coming to you and just says, hey, I have this idea. You don't really have the full picture. When I went to them and said, hey, David Drake has agreed to be in this anthology if you accept it. And that's the way I would pitch it to the authors. I'd say, hey, I have this idea. I want to pitch it to Baen. Would you be interested in participating if they accepted the anthology? And, in most cases, people would say, sure, knock yourself out. Other cases, they say maybe. So when you write the pitch, you definitely want to include those names, because sometimes the success of the anthology, if you were to put a name like Stephen King on an anthology, you would instantly sell more. I mean, it's almost
absolutely
easy bet.
Same is true of Neil Gaiman. He's an instant boost. So would you? I mean, if you're planning to pitch to Baen, would you early on approach Baen authors so that Baen would feel comfortable with the package?
Yes. So you definitely should have Baen headliners.
Yeah.
And I don't know how that applies to other publishers, but for Baen, in my experience, and I don't want to generalize my experience across everyone else, but in my experience, even in the marketing that they're using, they focus on Baen headliners, because in my view, they have a very strong customer base.
Yeah.
They have because they have a very specific brand.
Yeah.
And if you introduce something that's a little bit different, or that's experimental, they're more likely going to take a chance on it if they know and like the authors.
Yeah.
What I'm hoping is that not only will the customer, traditional Baen customers enjoy the anthology, which I think they will, but I'm also hoping that they get an appreciation for authors that they might not necessarily read before, like John Langan, who's an absolute giant when it comes to the other the weird fiction genre.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely. And I think there's just knowing that Dave Drake is going to be in it, Mike Resnick is going to be in it. I try to stay on top of Kevin Andrew Murphy's stuff. So, yeah. Now, you have one other that I wanted to briefly mention on our brief time left. You have your own collection out called Alien Abattoir. I think that's cool.
Yeah, so that was an experiment. So that is like early on in my career. And this is something I'm going to continue to do, but I want to be more disciplined about it, because the last time what I did is when I sold a certain number of stories, I wanted to have that those stories in one consolidated collection. I also wanted to experiment with self-publishing and all aspects of self-publishing. And so what I did is, after in my first 10 stories or so, I sold about 8 of them. And there were 2 that, I didn't sell, but I, put into that anthology. But I figured if somebody was willing to buy the first 8, then it was probably good enough. So, I put it out because there's a little bit of market validation. I also experimented with doing an audiobook, which, also was a great experience. The audiobook is absolutely amazing. Nigel, who was the narrator, has, there was some German in the book, because I have some World War II stories. So he spoke German. His pronunciation was bang on. I wanted to just get that experience of putting it together, commissioning a cover, and, just seeing what it was like. So I had experience with it. And, I would say, over the years, it's sold pretty well for a no-name author, but, I wouldn't, if it were a professional publishing company, they wouldn't consider it a success. So I probably sold maybe close to 100 copies, but that's pretty good for, coming out of nowhere and selling my first 10 stories.
I think it's awesome. And I really appreciate that you've kind of given a new approach than we've had from other folks of saying, do your research first, figure out what they want, what they're doing. So this is fantastic. And I'm going to put links to their stories. The upcoming anthology is available in October. Is that correct? October
6th is the launch
October
date. You can actually, if you can't wait, you can get the eArc now from Baen. It's like $1 less, but it's, if there were any like errors between that and the final version, right, which is minimal, but that will not have picked up those errors yet.
Well, we will sneak a link to that in.
Yeah, they're selling the eArc. Aren't they afraid that it will end up all over the internet in those, here's a free copy of the eArc sites?
I don't know. I don't know how well the security is on those things. I would imagine they'd be the same as a regular ebook.
But we'll put links to them and the other things we mentioned on our website, which is www.writersdrinkingcoffee.com. You can also find us on Facebook or Twitter. We love email. Sean, if they want to reach out to you and have questions, are you willing to answer a little email?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. You've been listening to Writers Drinking Coffee, a labor of love and enthusiasm put together by the hosts. Our main web support magic is brought to you by Deirdre McGaffey-Schween, and our sound engineer and backup web spider is David Welsh. Our intro music is Pretty Maid Milking a Cow, and our exit music is Breakfast with a Morning Person, both by Michael Engberg. You can hear more from Michael Engberg on manyhatsmusic.com. Our podcast sponsor is always Jackal Design, allowing you all to buy cool WDC swag and t-shirts. And hey, thanks so much for listening.